reasonable journeys here this morning. Before we start, a little bit of logistics. So you all have individual itineraries for the day. So in your notes, yeah? So please could you try and stick to them because they are all sort of individual. If there's any meetings that have been arranged that you can't make, could you let one of the organisers know? Other details, there is a fire exit just behind the Tradeshift banner there, or there's another one at the back of the room. There are apparently bathrooms on all the floors, sorry, not in America, toilets on all of the floors, starting to the right, I believe. Coffee is always on the next floor up, and I believe all of our sessions today, apart from this one, are upstairs. Okay. There are very brief breaks between the slots, so there's an opportunity to grab coffee in between those breaks, but if you could try and shuffle your way through the coffee into the next session reasonably promptly so that we don't screw up the agenda and we're not all here till 6:30 this evening, that would be terrific. What else have I got to say? Right, George Bernard Shaw said that the reasonable person, paraphrasing slightly, reasonable person expects to adapt and change to fit his circumstances, environment, whereas the unreasonable person expects the world to change to fit with their expectations and environment. Therefore, it follows that all progress depends on unreasonable people. So I will be awarding a small prize today for the most unreasonable and outrageous statement made by the panelist, the speaker, or through a question, because I think it would be great if we today, in this intimate group, make some progress. Okay, so that's my request for you. I haven't decided what the prize should be yet. I will be looking for something to award as a prize later. So don't get too excited, it will be very small. Right, and the judge's decision will be final. So with that, we're going to start with a panel discussion. And the subject we're going to talk about is around agility and innovation. So just to kick that off, historically, I think we all know procurement's known for cost reduction, about organisational efficiency, for managing suppliers. Our organisations that we work with expect that from us already. But we also know that we live in increasingly uncertain times where new entrants, new competitors, the market circumstances, things like Brexit, things like Trump, etc., are causing all sorts of disruption and uncertainty for our businesses. And our businesses are all looking for innovation, for agility. So I think the question that we wanted to start with and open to the panel is, what does that mean for procurement? What could procurement's role be in terms of agility and innovation? And I'm going to join the panel discussion as well as chairing it. So who would like to kick off with what does agility mean for procurement?
Ladies first? Or?
Thank you. Good morning. Firstly, apologies. I think we're just in time, myself and my colleague from Nissan. I think we're famed for just-in-time delivery, and I think this morning was a perfect example of that. So good morning, and it's good to be here again. I think I can see some faces I recognised from last time when we were all in Newport. I'm the Vice President for Purchasing for Nissan in Europe, looking after the operations we have in the UK, in Spain, and also across all of the regional business units in terms of the sales and marketing operations. And certainly we can see a lot of change. I certainly agree with you in terms of what's happening, and the level of uncertainty seems to be ever increasing. I think the difference perhaps is the pace of change that we can see and the pressures that's then bringing into the procurement or the purchasing environment. And our ability to respond to those changes is the key. And I think the key for us then is, as leaders of the organisations, is very much about the anticipation. So looking at the famous case for us at the moment, for example, with the plant in Sunderland is Brexit. And what's the impact? If the vote is yes, if the vote is no, what happens and how do we respond? So I think the key very much is about anticipation and building teams with a resilience that they are able to anticipate would be my first opening statement.
Thank you. And sorry, I should have introduced everyone. So if you can introduce yourselves when you answered the question, it would be great.
Sure.
Is that something we're seeing in other sectors as well, or is that?
Yeah, and look, let me introduce myself. Simon Boggis. I'm former CEVA Logistics CPO. I worked in that company for 32 years, joined as a boy of 18. Originally it was a company called TNT, and logistics division was spun off and became CEVA. I turned 50 March the 7th, and March the 8th I left because I wanted to venture out and do some other things, meet other people and set up my own operation. But let me just maybe talk about CEVA and how we operate, because actually people like Nissan would have been great customers for CEVA. And I think what we've seen is that companies have to become more responsive to unpredictable demands. I mean, Brexit's one example, but manufacturers are looking to become more leaner, more efficient, more productive. And so it's incumbent upon the companies that serve them to, at all levels, be as agile and as responsive as possible. So in my old day of when we set up procurement maybe 32 years ago, procurement was looking at pens and pencils and indirect, non-controversial spend. But, procurement matured and became a more strategic function for the company. And we had to respond very, very quickly to the needs of the business. So I think on one angle, it's about responsiveness, it's about flexibility. I could not go back to my CEO and say that Nissan have changed their plans, they would like immediate support, procurement needs to be involved. Well, our ISO process means that it will take 6 months before we can do that. That's not going to wash. So I think that's happened very quickly in the logistics space, supply chain, and I think other companies maybe have been immune to that to a certain extent, but it will catch up with people. I think people need to be able to be responsive. Another side of the coin is if you said to my CEO, what does agile mean? It means doing more with less. I don't want you to have more resource. I want you to be more resourceful. I want you to use innovation. I want you to use technology to cover more ground and add more value. So I think as this discussion opens up, we'll find that being agile is more than one thing. But certainly, maybe that's a good case example with Nissan and somebody like CEVA having to meet the demands of its demanding customer, rightly so.
So I think agility is probably a fundamental. Hey, I'm Christian, by the way. I'm the founder of Tradeshift. I'm going to do a keynote on agility later, so I'll be talking a lot about this. I hope you don't get tired about it. And the reason I'm talking a lot about it is I think agility is the fundamental challenge for companies today, and I think it's the fundamental challenge and maybe actually opposed to most of the practices that procurement have been practicing for the last 20 years. And at its core, you can think about what procurement have been doing. Procurement has been trying to achieve a low cost of transaction on everything you do. And the way you drive a low cost of transaction is by doing long-term contracts, long-term investments, long-term standardization of infrastructure, long-term everything. And unfortunately, the great thing about long-term is it gives you low cost of transaction. The unfortunate side effect of it is it gives you an extremely high cost of change. And I know one of the questions is actually how are we going to measure, so I'm going to jump a little bit into how we're measuring agility. To me, agility is to have a low cost of change. And unfortunately, I would say almost all of the companies we talk with today have an extremely high cost of change. I'll take a real-world example of a customer of ours that needed to move very quickly because of some changes in legislation, a factory from China to the Philippines. And it took them 3 months because they're really good at the physical side. They have it down with machines, how to build factories, how to do the lighting, all of that stuff. They're like a machine in that. It took them 3 months to move all of that, the infrastructure, set it up. It took them 9 months to redo the IT system to fit the process. It took another 6 months to get the last approvals within the procurement process to actually do it. So we're in a situation where the physical move of infrastructure took 3 months, and it took 5 times as long to do the digital and process change. And that's what you face when you have a high cost of change. Mm-hmm. It simply is not possible for you to move fast. And I think if you look at the market historically, since the 90s, everything has been very stable. Every year, companies went up a little bit if they just lowered cost a little bit. Like shareholders rewarded that, we're a little bit more efficient, a little bit more cost, off the books, a bit of margin. Okay, we'll, notch up a few more percent. But that's completely thrown out the window. Look at the last 12 months. The market in the future will reward you for being alive. And it doesn't really matter that you're 2% cheaper if your plane crashed. So to us, we're seeing a very, very different market dynamic going forward. And I think agility has moved from being a nice to have to be an imperative if you want to survive the next 10 years. So, yeah.
That's interesting. And I'm curious to explore a little bit more about the measures part. So I get the bit about the cost of change, but are there characteristics that would describe an agile organisation, procurement organisation or buying organisation of any description? What sorts of things would we expect to see in there?
Well, certainly if I can throw my hand in first, I think we'll all be familiar with the usual procurement, which is cost savings target. It's always going to be out there. I mean, that's your bread and butter as a procurement team, and cash improvement. But for us, when we talked about agility, it was a case of, serving the business. That's what our procurement infrastructure's in there for, is to serve the needs of the business. So number one was around the customer satisfaction. I know that might seem soft, but we wanted the business to tell us, were we performing to their expectation? Were we delivering? Were we being quick enough? We also had response times to inquiries. So if we had a new tender business with business development, how quickly could we turn around a piece of project work? So we had some clear KPIs. I think it's, for every company, it might be slightly different, but it's a case of speaking to the executive management and saying, what are the key performance indicators that really are important to this company that we can measure beyond our pure play of cost? One thing I would say, just quickly interjecting, is if you look at HR, human resources, it used to be called personnel, if anybody knew that. And it wasn't just a conscious decision to change the name to human resources. They decided that to be at the very top seat of the table in the executive board, we need to get away from doing all of the paperwork forms and filling out all of the interview letters and doing that. That can be done by the business. Let's take the kind of transactional stuff, the things that don't add real value, let the business fulfill that. And I think that's the challenge that procurement has to do to become more agile, is the transactional stuff of raising purchase orders and keying them into the system. No disrespect, but we could train monkeys to do that. You don't actually need to do that as a procurement team. That is going to add no real value to the organisation. So it's, again, how you free up the resource to help the business, and then you work with the business to identify key performance indicators that can measure your success. So there's no intangibles of, well, I think we're really agile. I'm not sure about that. So hopefully that's given a little bit of clarity.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that in terms of having some key performance indicators and changing. And one of the things we're looking at within Nissan in Europe, within the after-sales area in particular, is really looking at the customer expectations and how do we support that as an enabler to the business. The customer's expectations, how can we then drive the profit in the business as a performance enabler and partner in the business, rather than it all being about compliance and cost reduction and so on, which can typically be the area that we fall into in terms of contract management. So it's how do we really become a more agile organisation to focus on the needs of driving the business forwards with the goal of the overall objectives in mind.
I think there's a really interesting, so Christian made a comment which was actually quite challenging, which is procurement's been focused on driving long-term relationships with our suppliers. And I think, looking at the room, that's something I think that would probably all resonate with us. We're looking for building strategic relationships, long-term relationships of partnership, relationships that create mutual value, etc. Is that incompatible with agility in our supplier relationships? Should we, for example, be looking to change our suppliers more rather than less?
Just to start, because I made that comment, so I want to say, in itself, long-term relationships are not bad. They can actually be good if you want to be agile, but it depends on how you set them up.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you set up your long-term relationships to be very strictly, very narrowly defined, and very much through a cost lens, you'll probably find that it's very hard to change them and require big negotiation. But I think one of the things that we see as one of the key trends right now is moving from what I call commodity-based or cost-based procurement to outcome-based procurement, right? So I was working with a major car company, not Nissan, another one, an American one, and the CPO there said, look, we stopped buying drill bits. And I said, what do you mean? I mean, you definitely didn't stop needing drill bits. And I said, no, we started buying holes because we really realized we didn't need a drill bit. We needed a hole of a certain depth and a certain accuracy. And we're much more interested in buying the hole. And what I mean with that is, if you switch to an outcome-based process, it's also much easier to become agile, right? Because if you've been buying drill bits, that's what's in your system, that's what you're buying, that's what you're contracting, and you have no relationship really with the supplier outside delivering that drill bit. But if you're buying a hole, you need to talk to the supplier about what kind of hole, how long, and you don't care about the drill bits they deliver, you care about the hole being there and being of that quality. And that also means if your need change, you now have a dialogue, you have a template, and by the way, you also have a contract that allows you to talk about service levels, that allow you to talk about an outcome. So for me, I think it's not necessarily the length of the supplier relationship, it's the shape and the form of it. And I think in the future, the trend we see is going to be way more outcome-based procurement.
Yeah.
And I honestly think the commodity buy, especially for direct materials, the commodity-based approach to procurement is probably going to be less and less and less. Because guess what? On the delivery side, companies are also going to be delivering more and more outcomes. I mean, we're not that far away from car companies delivering cars as a service, right? So you really want to make sure that your value stream is aligned with that top line value.
Do you know, and actually on that point, I don't know what you guys think on suppliers. My former CFO, one of them, says to me, relationships cost me money. You know, fine. To my quipping reply is, I'll tell all our customers not to work with us for more than a year then, which didn't sit too well with them. But the point is, the wrong relationships cost you money. I think it's, when you set up a supplier relationship, we always had this mantra of you share in our risk and you share in our success. And we truly want to build strategic relationships with the core of our supply base, because you do need to generate innovation ideas. We simply can't be the masters of everything, and we would often go out with a tender and say, this is what we want to buy, but also could you tell us what our competition might be doing, or have you got any other suggestions for us? Tap into their knowledge base, but you also have to be mindful that if this relationship sours, how do I exit? How have I set the contracting up? Is it flexible? So often we like long-term relationships, but we like some kind of flexibility in there or contingency to get out of it. But I would always encourage to try to build on those relationships and try to seek out new ways, new ideas, and a lot of that will flow through to when we're working to our front-end customers. Sorry if I keep on looking at you, Judith. But,
yeah.
That's okay. But that's what I would say is that absolutely Christian's right, is that cost of change can be tremendous, and you can end up being locked into ugly relationships because it's going to be too expensive or difficult or risky to exit from it. So it's thinking about that, but also maximising what you can get from that relationship.
I think also it's fair to say that depending on what you're buying, your different commodities, actually you have to take a different approach with each supplier. So taking the same approach with the security company is completely different to taking an approach with the exactly, or even if we're looking at the next generation of Qashqai and X-Trail that we've recently announced we're going to be building in the UK. So we're now starting to look at what's going to be on those cars, what is the innovation that's going to be in there, how do we support that with our customers, and we're having to work in different ways with the suppliers who have the technology to be able to do that, to get the innovation and breakthrough that we need for our customers. So we have to treat each supplier in a different way and have different strategic relationships with them in order to be able to meet the needs of the business.
And is that working with your existing suppliers, or are those new suppliers? Have you had to go out and find somebody who's got different technologies?
It can be a real mix. Some of them are core suppliers that have been with us for a long time, and they're evolving and developing, and we're working together in strategic relationships. Other things that are coming through, completely new to us, completely new areas, we don't know them. And one of the key challenges, I think, bringing it back to the agility topic, is when we look at our governance compliance issues, you need a supplier who has a particular history in terms of financial stability. They need to certify certain tick boxes all the way through the process. And if you look at some of the startups, the guys that are in their bedrooms doing clever digital stuff now, they don't fit our criteria. So how do we then make ourselves agile enough to be able to encourage those suppliers and new businesses and encourage them as they're growing, and yet actually still mitigate the risk that we can see and avoid exposing ourselves to unnecessary risk in the business. And that's one of the challenges we're facing and we're discussing at the moment, is how do we move ourselves as a procurement function to be able to still meet the needs and follow the compliance that we have in place, and to be agile, to recognise that in the next 10 years, I think you said there, cars are changing. We see what we call now the decade of disruption. We're moving into mobility, intelligent mobility as we call it. So the whole model is changing, and how do we flex and how do we change so that we can still be the successful company in 10, 20 years' time that we want to be. There's many pressures on us.
So I'm going to be a little bit provocative, hopefully. your organisations, which of your organisations, do you measure staff turnover?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you also measure supplier turnover?
Suppliers, staff turnover.
No.
Yeah.
The number
The
of
ones that left
suppliers
us.
that you change.
At a
Yes.
strategic level, yes.
Okay. And why do you measure that? Is that an indicator of agility, or is it something that you want to be low or high, or what's good in terms of changing your
I
supply
think we
base?
want to understand why. I think that's the thing. It's just to understand the trend and why. And we would always encourage, after every big tender, after every relationship, if it finished, we always seek out and we always offer an audience to the suppliers to understand why they didn't win the business, for example, or we want to know why somebody may have left the relationship. Because again, it's understanding. And a lot comes from that. When somebody comes in and said, if only I'd known that, maybe I could have actually approached it in a different way. So I think it's important. There's not one specific reason when I was in the chair doing that role, but it was more a case of understanding the market and the dynamics and why things are happening. That's keeping it simple, I think.
And for us, I think we work within, we try and keep control within the number of suppliers that we're working with. So we have a particular count of suppliers that we have within our panel, and we measure against that rather than measuring in terms of supply turnover. Sorry,
Yeah.
that's what you were asking about.
Okay.
Staff turnover.
So the aggregation thing. So is agility, to your point around introducing new suppliers, potentially there's a sort of smart technologist in their bedroom.
Yeah.
Is that compatible with the things that we've been doing over the last few decades around driving aggregation? Because have we not been trying to reduce our supply base and aggregate supply into bigger, fewer relationships? It feels like this is a direct challenge to that.
It is a direct challenge to it, and there are certain areas where it's right that we have that, and there's certain areas where we still will work with the aggregate.
Judith's right on that. I mean, stationery, for example. I remember when we brought some spend analytics, which is another subject in itself, and we were working with our North American operation and saying to them, look, let's just have a look at all the different spends we have from different systems, brought it into one place, and we had a global deal with Office Depot, don't mind saying, and everybody used it, and then we put on the spend analytics and saw we had 15 suppliers in North America servicing us with stationery. So, for that commodity item, very quickly, 14 got switched off and they're all Office Depot, and we were able to, but again, understood why were they using those other suppliers to learn more about that. So it's different per commodity, I think.
I think it's, so I'm on the vendor side here, so obviously I really appreciate what you're saying about, we're not in the bedroom, we're quite a big company, right? But we still go through this every single time. And I think, today we work with 75 of the Fortune 500 companies in the world, and we still get the question like, but you're only 6 years old. And I'm like, you actually don't want a cloud computing company that's more than 6 years old, because that's like sour milk. It's not good. And I think, I'm going to be quite provocative now, but I think there's a multi-layered challenge. The first challenge is that the IT departments of the Fortune 500, the FTSE 100, they don't know about cloud computing, and they don't know how to buy this stuff. I'll be frank. The next problem is all procurement people in the world think they are IT experts, and they think they can define what they need. And the problem is, then you go out and buy the same stuff because that's the stuff you know, and you don't. And I think one thing we would wish to see a lot more is to invite suppliers to come in and challenge your thinking. The moment we get dragged in is when you've defined you need a procurement system. And I think, quite frankly, that's way too late. Because 90% of you actually don't need a procurement system like you think you need one. And I've been on the customer side, and we built this because we really saw a very different future. But we kind of, and I'll tell this very, very frankly, like, if we just get a cold RFP template to fill out, we pass. Because we know that RFP template is shaped by 20 years of thinking in what you need in procurement. And my answer will be 90% of the things you think you need in here, we can get rid of in a different way. You don't even need to do them. But to do that, we need to sit down and talk about how you don't need catalogs. Because we can actually have a centralized product repository. We need to sit down and talk about what artificial intelligence can do for you on the decision side. Why your idea that you need to ask every single person in your organization 2 or 3 times to approve something is completely insane. There's something called random sampling. You only need 5% of your population to actually have a test group that's big enough to get the same result without harassing all your people. So I think, to the bigger point, it's not just that these organizations maybe don't know. I mean, we can talk about the financial requirements of dealing with a startup, and many of us are. I mean, a very real example. I have more capital than a quite well-known electronic invoicing provider here in the UK who's listed on the stock exchange. But still, they're getting seen as blue chip, and we're getting seen as, risky. I don't know why. So I think one is a change in mindset about where's disruption coming from, and the second thing is, I think really in the decade to come, if you see what's happening in cloud computing right now, if you see what's happening in all of these tool sets, the idea that you think you know what you need, I would say it's best presumptuous. So go out and really challenge yourself to learn what's the next generation of stuff. And I always say the benchmark today is no longer your competitors. You think, so if you're in logistics, you think your benchmark is Kuhn and Nagel and others. It's not. Go look at what Uber is doing. Go look at what Amazon is doing. If you're in retail of any kind, your competitor is not another retailer, it's Amazon. If you're in the car industry, go look at what Google are doing, what Apple are doing. Because the way they run the operations, the way they think about procurement is so radically different from you can't even imagine it. So I think, if you really want to think about agility and you want to move it outside the box of just a few metrics, you really need to challenge yourself. And I think a lot of it is just we're reproducing the same systems because we already have the processes in place. It's 4 years in, we need to change our system, at least do a tender. Anybody have the spreadsheet from last time?
I agree with a lot of it. I think probably not doing justice to maybe the intellect of some of the individuals. I think there are people on the cutting edge of that. I mean, certainly, I do agree. From our procurement perspective, I mean, when I wanted people in IT procurement, I hired the people from IT because I thought, well, I can teach them procurement processes. We can give them negotiation training skills, but I can't take a procurement guy and educate them all about the IT side. When we wanted somebody from running our ground transport, we went into the operations team and we pulled people out who knew about transport and brought them in and said, we'll give you all the procurement training, we'll turn you into procurement negotiators, but you bring such valuable skills. And then they had the credibility when they go back to IT and when they go back to transport operations because they've been in that job, they're talking to people the same language. But then the clever bit is exactly what you said, which is to go out to market and actually say, look, you need to tell us cutting edge. What's going on? Blue sky, what could we do? Because the business will always challenge you in procurement to come up with solutions for their challenges. And so what do? Do you sit in the office, as you say, and say, well, okay, what should we do between us? But the answers usually are outside there. And again, people like Amazon, for example, I know I've left CEVA now, but I can tell you now they are acutely aware of Amazon, but they need to be. And that's how you stay ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested. So the Uber is a great example of called the gig economy. The idea that you're not necessarily needing to deal with an enterprise. You can deal with a crowd of individuals, effectively. And theoretically, you could imagine a world where you don't have logistics companies. You have 10,000 people with vans.
There comes some security issues with that, of course.
Indeed, there might be. So, but I'm curious, and the days where the only way to get a bit of creative work done was to go to a creative agency, whereas now you can use crowdsourcing and have a bunch of smart people around the world, teenagers if necessary. Legally, but people, you're accessing a global supply market of individuals.
You are right to a point.
To what extent does that again challenge procurement? To what extent do we have a role to play in leveraging that kind of marketplace, or is that something that's still a little bit scary, a bit difficult for us?
Look, I mean, let maybe Judith onto a second, but just to answer that one in the logistics space, there is a kind of we're living in a more dangerous world. I mean, that's the other side of it around security. And, when you're entering commodity items into a logistics supply chain that are venturing then onto aircraft and onto boats and so on, there are very rigorous security protocols that go around that. So the temptation is to almost look for the cost-cutting approach. Say, we'll just pull a man with a van in and we'll throw the parcel on board. I'm using Nissan. It's Nissan's freight. Don't chuck it on there. They won't care. But I can tell you now that when we're given, we have to sign up to an extensive, scope of security challenges, insurance underwriting, because of course it's very important to that customer Some freights you can co-share, some are bespoke to them. But I think that we have tried to look for a more flexible network of approved agents that we can use. And what you're trying to do is free up your assets and make it more fluid, more flexible. So when you don't have a 5-day working week, then you can take cost out of it. So I think in balance, we have to look at all of those options, look at what Amazon are doing, the use of drones, for example, over drivers, and all this different technology that's out there. And what I see is procurement has to be a facilitator to collaborate with all of the functions across the company. It can't just be, we're procurement, this is what we do. We've got to be working with all of the functions collectively, and then those functions has to be working with some fantastic new technology emerging. You've got Tradeshift today is a great example of people pushing boundaries, pushing thinking, and challenging the old school. So that I do believe.
I think maybe just turn it to the procurement organization. Why do you all have the same category managers in the same categories? I mean, my belief actually is if you go 10 years forward, most of the back office will be on demand, right? So, I mean, do you really need a back office? I'm very provoking, right? And actually I disagree completely with you on the security, right? So. Right. In San Francisco, I would feel much safer in an Uber than I would in a cab. If you've ever ridden a cab in San Francisco, you know what I mean, right? So and Uber just launched, like literally 3 weeks ago, Uber Freight, right? And I was talking, I really don't want the logistics industry to go to away. We have amazing customers from the logistics industry, and I think they are innovating and they are pushing the boundaries, right? But if you look at Uber, right, they have 600 million credit cards and user accounts in the application. You already have your brain connected to the idea that they will move you from A to B. So you're probably also going to trust that they're going to get your stuff from A to B. And, you know, I don't know if you ever tried to go to a logistic company's website to actually figure out how you move stuff from A to B. It's not easy. And I'm really, like, I'm that serious. Like, if you try to go say, okay, you need to figure out if what you have is a parcel or a package, or like, why? Why do I need to know all of this? Why can't I have stuff, it needs to go from A to B, you figure it out. And I think that's sort of the premise of the promise. It's not just about the gig economy, but it's also the new kind of user experience. It's the new kind of way you're delivering a service. And I think these solutions, not just within logistics, but think about your own back office, think about your category management, think about all of these functions. Ask yourself, how many of these are strategic for our business?
Yeah.
And if they're not strategic for your business, they're probably going to be part of a platform like this in the future. And so what we saw beginning with cabs will probably go much, much deeper going forward. And that's also how you'll get the agility, right? Like you say, if you had the situation where you had to move some assets and now you don't, but if you had to if you can pull on a search on resources, and I know the same from the BPOs, right? The BPOs also talk about moving to on demand. They don't just want to be like a flatlining of resources, because they know you've got to be much more agile in the future. So, can procurement be an on-demand platform?
Good question.
Yeah. Can you be the gig economy here?
To what extent? Let me guess. I would suggest that most procurement organisations use contractors and consultants from time to time.
Yes, from time to time.
But could that be actually the majority of our organisations? Could we be, or would that be desirable? To buy in particular skills and talents on a sort of power by the hour basis?
I mean, I think the starting point is taking away a lot of the transactional activity that is unproductive for us. And that's what I mentioned when you saw HR. I think they've been quite clever to move a lot of that responsibility into the business. And that's allowed them to get more into talent development and, managing people and looking at performance and so on. So I think there are elements of that. I mean, in my old function, we set up a department, a section called enablement. And it's exactly that. It was about supporting the business to be able to fulfill things for themselves. So it was just a small commitment from our side with a few people to educate the business and allow the operations managers at site. And they would have a punch-out network of goods that they could buy directly themselves. And they didn't have to come to us. It's pre-agreed. It just punches out. They can buy off of that approved list, and that was the route to market. So I think that was our first attempts to start to become more agile, to free up that resource so that we could be more in tune with the demands of the business and business development, and elevate the strategic importance of procurement. And for us, we've got to have strong leadership in procurement to go back to the board and say, hey, I want to do more for this company. I want to add more value, but you've got to help me as well. I want to be able to remove some of the unproductive It's going to add no bottom line value for me filling out purchase orders. We need to think differently. And some companies will, in this room, there'll be a mixed bag. Some people will already be doing that and others are on that journey. And that's where you see, I think, IT are in the board. And they're probably 10 years, 5 years ahead of procurement, where procurement is still going up the ladder, but needs to, because it has such strategic value to a company.
Yeah, I think certainly within Nissan we have some areas where we use contractors or consultants, and there's other areas that we definitely do in-house. And then we've also followed the outsourcing model on certain areas as well. So we do have to look, using that dreadful phrase as you call it, category management, we do look at what's very strategically important to us as a business, what's core, where do we get the best value of items that we control in-house, that's ours, that's our know-how. And then what are we better off outsourcing or giving to a consultant or giving to a contractor? So it is having that ability. I think in the introduction I was talking about the anticipation, and that's really where as a procurement function we need to add the value to the organisation by working with the partners, working with the stakeholders and the budget holders to understand right at the beginning of the process what it is that they're doing, which will involve spending money with a third party. And then how do we best facilitate that as an organisation to be able to meet the end needs, and whether that's with a consultant who might have particular expertise, whether it's with a contractor who's a 16-year-old lad sat in his bedroom who's brilliant with creative ideas doing some new campaign for us. Where are we best positioned in order to support the business? That's our core role as purchase now.
And I think it's quite an interesting challenge for procurement, because if you cast your minds forward sort of 10 years and you imagine a world where some of our accepted truths, if you like, around aggregated relationships, big suppliers, risk-free, stable organisations could have changed really quite dramatically, where we're leading quite virtual organisations dealing with suppliers that are changing continually, lots of small suppliers, lots of high risk, all of the things that we would probably try and avoid now could be, I'm not saying they are, but they could be sort of part of our future. So I'm sort of curious to know is if those are the characteristics of innovation and agility, what's sort of holding us back right now? Other than, we talked about risk, what other things in our teams, or the way that we manage, or the skills that we have, or the knowledge that we have, makes it difficult for us?
I think one thing is the friction of our systems, right? So we so often see people talking about having few suppliers, and of course I know there's single sourcing, or putting spend on certain suppliers, which is a strategic benefits. But apart from that, there's actually no reason you should have few suppliers. The only reason there's really you should have few suppliers is the cost of managing them. And I think that cost is a result of the systems we use to manage them. So, I mean, if you look at Uber, they're managing hundreds of thousands of drivers globally with very few people. Uber use on average 2 people to manage a country. 2 people to manage a whole country. And so they're operating what is probably the largest people moving network in the world, with less than 1,500 people globally, including the IT and everything else, right? So I think there's a new order of systems that can do the stuff at a scale, at much different cost. So I think a big chunk of it, but it's not just systems, right? But the friction of systems is a huge chunk. The way our systems is set up, I mean, just the cost of adding a new supplier, going through the vetting process, all of this, I mean, you can see people go like, oh no. But I also think it is the fact that you have to do the same thing over and over every single time you do it. So that's probably one of the biggest ones. I also want to say something else, which is we tend to forecast the future always more like it is than it's really going to be. And if you're going to ask the cab drivers 10 years ago and said what's going to be the future, Airbnb versus the hotels, right? They would say no. This is so far away. You're dreaming, right? And the same. I know I'm putting on the point when I said is procurement really going to be a virtual organization in 10 years? But I'm pretty sure if you went and asked the cab drivers 10 years ago, they said this is a fantasy. It's never going to happen. Yeah. And I think. Probably happening faster than you think.
I mean, I was going to ask a quick question. If I just put this to the audience and just maybe show us a raise of hands, how many people feel procurement today is on an equal footing in the executive board with IT and finance, for example? Would you? Okay. So, but a lot of people think, and that's great, I mean, it's fantastic, but a lot of people also have to look at, and this is about stepping stones of evolution, and I don't think there's a one size for everybody. Each company has to look at, well, how does procurement get more attention? You know, how do we get the voice of procurement heard? How do we get the company mindset to change what procurement's about? I say, I'm sad, I worked for 32 years for TNT, kind of CEVA, the same company, and I joined as a boy of 18. You know, I ended up in kind of procurement, as a lot of people do. And we were just buying the stationery and we were buying bits and pieces. But gradually, in time, and I do think the last recessions helped it immensely, that, you know, we were being asked to go and work with IT. Then we were being asked to look at ocean freight and air freight. Well, I don't know everything about that, but I was able to bring the talents in from those areas and say, look, you've got a lot of industry knowledge. I've got a lot of time allocated to me now to work with you. I can bring process, these tools and so on. So I think part of it's also to become more agile, you've also got to have a voice in your company. And you've got to be seen as a core strategic function of that organisation. And some people I speak to in procurement often go away frustrated and say, look, you know, it's hard enough, I'm just doing the daily grind. So I think we also need to go through a transformation of the procurement function so that it is on an equal footing, so that companies are listening to procurement first and foremost, and seen it as part of the strategic solution to the company. And that will enable us to become more agile on that path.
Thank you. Right, so I think we should pause and allow the audience to ask us some provocative and difficult questions. There may be a prize for the most difficult question. So just in terms of what we talked about, we talked a little bit about the challenge of prediction and what the future holds for us. We talked about the challenges of our processes and whether they help us with agility and innovation. We've talked about the cost of change as being one of the sort of key blockers, if you like, or the enablers if we get it right. We talked about shifting the size or changing the size and shapes of the contracts and the relationships that we have. The importance of knowing what we need, so the outcome-based contracting relies on that. We talked about risk and our appetite for risk, particularly dealing with small, innovative, unknown suppliers. And risk of innovative markets. You know, how much do we know about the market and how it's changing? And the challenge that some of these things cause us in terms of our accepted truths. So things like aggregation and large supplier relationships. And so far, my winner for most provocative statement or unreasonable statement is there's no reason to have fewer suppliers. So I may have misquoted, but I'm going with that. Right, so questions from the audience, thoughts, observations, or disagreements even. Right.
Yeah, so talked about Airbnb, which is a consumer solution. And Uber is predominantly a consumer solution, so it's sort of targeted towards the younger generation. And I just wonder if the panel thinks that the age profile of procurement leaders and the age profile of the board and the executive actually holds back innovation because they don't get it. They don't understand the technology and what's possible.
Great question. Just as a quick show of hands, who in the audience has used both Airbnb and Uber personally?
Yeah.
Okay.
So us oldies are getting it to us. Do you know, I think it's great, and you could extend that to diversity, you know, and I did two things in my role before I was chairman. I always like to say I was chairman of our disability working group and also gender. And to be truthful, I think it's about, you know, age profile, it's also about the mix of people and understanding the world. You know, we struggled in certain parts of the world, and having the right leadership definitely helps. And so I think you're right. I remember years ago that Shell did a big piece, and they introduced something called the Mirror Board, where they brought a young group of people no older, I don't know if you know, no older than I think 25, let's say. And these guys were shadowing the board and bringing up some great innovative ideas, and they ended up filling all their petrol stations with sweets and goodies and so on. They were one of the first to market with that. People saying, well, it would be a great seller. So I think your point's absolutely right, and we need to find new, innovative, creative ways, and you need to have the right minds projecting those ideas, but people receiving those ideas as well.
Yeah. I mean, as Nissan, our great thing is innovation and excitement for everyone, and that's certainly, you'll see it as the tagline or our adverts, hopefully. And that's very much our mindset, and our board have that mindset. So if you look at electric vehicles, EV, Leaf was the first mass market EV. There's over 250,000 of them on the road now. You know, maybe Tesla has the voice, the perception, but we were the pioneers, and as the alliance with Renault, we're certainly number one in EV on the world. So it's that mindset, and I challenge whether it's an age item. I don't think it's anything to do with age. I think it's about mindset, it's about openness, it's about willingness to be open-minded and adopt the new innovative technologies, and that's the key, is to have the culture in the organisation that encourages that innovation, no matter whether you're brand new into the organisation as the new grads who are coming in, who I think are a fantastic source of new information, or whether it's the guys who've been in the company for 20, 30, 40 years plus. True. And it's having that mix and the blend and making sure you've got the new brilliant ideas, the experience, and putting that together to say, how does this really support the business going forwards? How's this really driving customer performance for what our customers really need? And it's making sure that you get that ability to mix the two together.
No, you are absolutely right, but I would have to say the older you get, people tend to get more set in their ways. And I have to remember when the first time I was approached about working from home, and I was going, working from home? You know, and I actually was, and I said I'm living proof that dinosaurs can evolve. And I think that's absolutely true, that we have to have that. But you're absolutely right, it's about the blend and the mix.
So maybe just to add a follow-up question, how many here have used Airbnb or Uber in their business? Okay, right, so there you see the difference, right? Yeah. And I think that's actually why you need, both have really excellent business products. So actually, I have no stake in this, but just check them out. They're really easy to use, and they collect all of the data and receipts digitally. So.
Can I tell you why we don't use them?
Yeah, why?
Because up to about 3 months ago, Uber didn't have a corporate account function, and only up to very recently have they actually allowed pre-booking, which you actually need to use Uber in the business. So now they're doing that, we're actually talking to them.
So they're evolving.
That's a good thing. We had probably a little longer in San Francisco with the corporate, so I think we've been using it for 12, 18 months. But yeah, and I think, so the reason is, right, I mean, we use all of these tools in our private lives, right? We use Facebook, we use LinkedIn, we use Uber, we use all of these things. But I think the change happens when we're daring and willing to, and feel there's an environment where we can pull it in and work and say, why on earth are we not using this, right? So, yeah.
Can I, Alan Waller here, FSO Consulting, I'm Vice President of Supply Chain Innovation for FSO. Can I just introduce supply chain into the conversation and get the panel's view on agility in procurement for supply chain? So just my background is 30 years in consultancy. I was a partner in PwC, set up the global supply chain and ran that practice, and also set up the Cranfield supply chain operation, Cranfield School of Management. I did have a real job once, by the way. I worked in the steel industry. I used to make things. I was a production manager and worked in the supply chain. But I mean, I see procurement, I'm not a procurement expert, I see procurement as a function in its own right, which has great value. It's also part of the supply chain process.
Yes.
And if you look at supply chain as a process, you know, in the words of the supply chain operational reference model, SCORE, it's plan, source, make, deliver, return, etc.
Yeah.
So the source bit is the procurement. Now, in supply chain as a process, there's been an argument raging for centuries about lean versus agile. Yeah. So when we talk about agile, you know, that means responsiveness, but not just responsiveness within procurement as a function, but responsiveness of procurement to what is happening in the supply chain.
Totally right.
So look at vertical agility rather than, if you like, horizontal agility. And it's a great debate because the lean supply chain school, which emanated out of Cardiff University, which was all about reducing costs and so forth, and the response to that was initially very good because monies were taken out of the business, but then you know, some people said, well, companies were getting anorexia because you'd be so lean that they get anorexia, they can't move. And then there's the Cranfield School of Thought was agility. That's now all come together because it's recognised you have lean and agility. You can be lean and agile, lean and agile at the same time. I'm living proof of that, yeah? So, you can be lean and agile at the same time, or you don't have to be lean to be agile. But the question of the panel is, I'll be showing a case study in my stream later on, some work I did in a major business in Indonesia, where procurement was very strong, supply chain was very weak. We had to develop a new route to the market because of the growth of the consumerisation in Indonesia. And we had to, the business, if you like, had to relearn procurement, moving from procurement for cost and cash, which is the classic, but moving from that to procurement for an agile supply chain.
Yes.
So I'd like to just ask the panel about, when we talk about agility, we're going to talk about risk later on, what's the thinking in procurement, how you manage the balance between getting procurement optimised for procurement and getting procurement to optimise the total business operation?
Judith answered it very quickly about saying it's both. By the way, Alan, you kindly presented to me and my team actually, and you were very good. So I can just it's a few years back, so I'm sure it was a memorable event for you. So, but in fairness, so I think there was a time when we hit the recession, going back a few years now, that the company I worked for could have not survived, and it's amazing how the issues of environmental and all the things of survival. Lean very much. We had 400 people assigned to lean operations. But then the challenge came about agile supply chains. And that's why I talked about making sure that our procurement could actively work. And what we engage with is a lot more cross-collaboration with the leaders of our ocean freight, of our air teams. We were bringing people in from those functions into procurement, and we were hiring people into procurement to be sent back out into the supply chain, so getting this right mix and blend of people. So it's absolutely right about understanding the needs of the business, responding to it, being able to answer the customer demands whilst being as cost effective as you can, and finding fit for purpose solutions that are necessary for the business. So it is about a combination of agile and lean together. And the functions cannot work in isolation is the message.
But I do think there's a real challenge underpinning this, though, because I think sometimes we see, really good organizations on a process level, you have procurement working as a part of supply chain and thinking as part of a supply chain. Unfortunately, on an implementation level, we see it very rarely. And I'll give you an example, right? One of our customers is a shoe company. I'm wearing their shoes right now. They do quite well. They're very lean and agile. They've actually won several prizes for that. And we started digitizing their supply chain. And we went out to the suppliers and we said, okay, just give me a view. How many tools do you use to do business with this company? 24. And by the way, this is not a high number. I've on average seen more in most companies. So because there is no alignment on the implementation level, you see procurement going out and picking not one tool, typically 4 to 5 tools. You see demand planning going out and picking 2 to 3. You see treasury going out and picking 2 to 3. And what you end up with is a completely on the data level, and especially when you talk digitalization, it's a completely fragmented supply chain. And you don't see it because you sit on a very small part of the silo up top on procurement. But I tell you, the people who really see it is the suppliers. So if you want a really good view, if you want to have a benchmark on how are you doing on integrating your supply chain view versus your procurement view, go ask your suppliers how integrated it is. Yeah. And I just, like, the only plug I'm going to do for Tradeshift is we actually started the other way around. We said, let's build a platform where we can put all of the processes that happen between a buyer and seller on the platform, rather than going out every single time and buying a new tool and a new process. Because that is really what's hurting the agility of on the data level, right? And if you don't have agility on the implementation level, it's going to be very hard to have it higher up.
Yeah.
So. Right, I'm going to watch out for time, so I'm going to give Judith the last word, if you'd like to take it.
Thank you very much. No, I think it's been a really interesting debate, actually, looking at the full challenges from everything. So I think certainly thank you for the opportunity for talking to me.